The Grand Meridian Hotel, nestled in the heart of New York City, shimmered like a jewel beneath the city lights. Marble pillars gleamed. Crystal chandeliers cast dazzling light over polished wooden floors, and the soft sounds of a violin floated through the air. This was the gala for the partnership between Alden Law and Wolf Corp, a gathering of some of the most powerful figures in finance and politics. But to Talia Grayson, this opulent room felt like a golden cage, beautiful, yet suffocating. Talia stood in front of the mirror in the ladies' restroom, her hands trembling as she adjusted the tight red silk dress Maxwell had picked out. The dress clung to her figure, accentuating her graceful curves. But it wasn't something she had wanted to wear. The red was too loud, too flashy, screaming to the world that she was the perfect wife of Maxwell Alden. She looked at herself in the mirror, her brown eyes heavy with sorrow, lacking the sparkle of the lights outside. Her lips pressed together as her fingers brushed the zipper, almost pulling it down, as if trying to escape it all. But she stopped, took a deep breath, and whispered to herself, "Just one more night." She pushed the door open, the click of her heels echoing against the cold stone floor. Outside, the ballroom was packed. Men in finely tailored suits, women draped in glittering evening gowns, and smiles just as fake as the flashes from the photographers' cameras. Talia felt eyes glancing her way, but none truly saw her. They saw only Mrs. Alden, the beautiful wife of attorney Maxwell Alden, a rising star in political circles. Maxwell stood in the corner of the room, his sharp black suit accentuating his tall frame and icy demeanor. He was speaking with a group of partners, his smile polished but devoid of warmth. When he saw Talia, he waved her over. She walked toward him, each step feeling heavier. Maxwell took her hand. It was cold and his grip firm, more like a warning than affection. She wasn't a lover. She was an accessory, a piece of the perfect image he was building. "Smile," he whispered, his voice low and cutting. Talia forced a smile, her eyes drifting across the room, searching for something, anything to keep her from sinking. "This is Talia, my wife." Maxwell introduced her smoothly to one of his business associates, like presenting a prized possession. "You're a lucky man, Mrs. Alden," the man said with a polite smile. Talia lowered her head, lips pressed tight, her fingers nervously twisting under the table, a habit when she felt anxious. Maxwell didn't let her speak, continuing on about Alden Law's accomplishments, as though she were just part of the backdrop. Talia held a glass of champagne but didn't drink, letting the bubbles fizz and rise, soothing the tightness in her chest. Then the main doors opened and the atmosphere shifted. Damian Wolf walked in tall, broad-shouldered, with piercing, deep blue eyes like ice. He wore a charcoal gray suit with no tie, the top button of his shirt undone, radiating a confidence bordering on arrogance. The crowd instinctively parted, as if pushed by an invisible force. He didn't greet anyone with fanfare, didn't smile, just nodded at a few key figures, and walked as someone who never needed to prove anything. Damian Wolf, CEO of Wolf Corp., the man behind a multi-billion-dollar tech empire, was the center of every gaze, but he didn't seem to care. Talia looked up by chance and their eyes met. Damian was just a few feet away, speaking with a partner, but his gaze suddenly swept across the room and landed on her. Her heart skipped. She didn't know why. There was something in his eyes, not curiosity, not admiration, but recognition, as if he saw something she had tried so hard to hide. She quickly looked down, trying to mask her discomfort, her fingers clutching the champagne glass so tightly that her knuckles turned white. Damian paused just for a moment, but it was enough for his assistant to notice. He continued speaking, but his eyes didn't leave Talia. She stood beside Maxwell, holding her drink without sipping, leaning subtly away from her husband, as though trying to create space. Damian noticed the details, the way her lips tensed, the way her fingers twisted, the emptiness in her eyes despite the polite smile. Something in her sent a silent call for help, and he couldn't look away. Sensing a change in the air, Maxwell turned to Talia. "Come," he ordered, pulling her toward another group of associates. He introduced her again, but once more didn't let her speak. "Talia is my pride," he said, placing a hand on her shoulder, a gesture devoid of tenderness. Talia nodded, her eyes lowering again, fingers twisting. From afar, Damian watched, his gaze darkening, as if realizing a truth he didn't want to accept. The night reached its peak when Damien approached Maxwell's table. The room fell silent. All eyes were on the two most powerful men in the room. Maxwell stood, offering a polite smile and handshake. "Mr. Wolf, an honor," he said smoothly. Damien nodded, but his eyes weren't on Maxwell. They were on Talia, sitting quietly beside her husband, hands resting on her lap, gaze avoiding his. "Pleasure to meet you, Mrs. Alden," Damien said in a deep voice, emphasizing "you," as if he was speaking to her, not Maxwell's wife. He extended his hand. Talia hesitated, then placed her hand in his. His hand was warm and firm, the opposite of Maxwell's cold grip. Damien's rare, enigmatic smile made her heart race. "Thank you, Mr. Wolf," she replied softly. But their eyes held for too long, like time had stopped. There was something in his gaze that said he knew she didn't belong to the man beside her, like they'd known each other in another lifetime. Maxwell, sensing the silence drag on, interjected. "We're looking forward to working with Wolf Corporation." Damien nodded, but his eyes didn't shift from Talia. "So am I," he said, low and deliberate, but the words didn't feel like they were meant for Maxwell. As Damien walked away, Maxwell dragged Talia to the dance floor, gripping her wrist tightly. "Don't embarrass me," he hissed into her ear, his voice sharp as a blade. Talia nodded, her body stiff, but her eyes searched the crowd, found Damien. He stood alone in the corner, a glass of whiskey in hand, watching her intently. His eyes weren't judging nor possessive. They were trying to understand her, the real her. Talia looked away, trying to focus on the dance, but her heart wouldn't settle. She didn't know why, but the moment Damien's eyes met hers, she felt seen for the first time in 3 years of living in the dark. You're watching Soul Stories, where every story whispers of love, healing, and hope. Let us know which city you're watching from. Don't forget to subscribe and be a part of our journey. Now stay with us. The story is just beginning. The Wolf Corp headquarters, located on the 68th floor of a skyscraper in the heart of Manhattan, was a symbol of power and cold precision. Floor-to-ceiling glass walls offered a breathtaking view of the city's glowing lights, but the atmosphere inside was as sharp as a blade. Damien sat at the head of the conference table, his deep blue eyes scanning the numbers on the large screen, with the focus of a hawk hunting its prey. His team, some of the brightest minds in the tech industry, was presenting their report, but Damien's mind was elsewhere. The image of Talia from the gala a few days earlier kept surfacing in his mind. So vividly it unsettled him. Her sorrowful brown eyes, the way she gripped her champagne glass, the subtle recoil of her body when Maxwell touched her. He asked himself, in a voice cold but tinged with confusion, "Why do I even care?" Damien wasn't easily shaken. He had long mastered the art of locking his emotions away after a wound that had never healed. Memories returned like an old film reel. Himself, 24, a passionate young engineer, in love with a woman named Elena. She was beautiful, charming, and seemed to love him deeply. But then he discovered she had used him, his money, his status, even the tech ideas he shared, selling them to competitors. From that moment, Damien transformed into a ruthless CEO who trusted no one and believed even less in love. He built Wolf Corp into an untouchable empire, and his heart, like a vault of steel, stayed firmly shut. But Talia's eyes, it wasn't her beauty or charm, it was the silent yearning, like a bird trapped in a cage, that threw him off. She was unlike anyone he had ever met. She didn't seek attention, and that made it impossible for him to stop thinking about her. That evening, Damien attended a private dinner at an upscale restaurant, where Maxwell and a few other partners were invited to discuss the pending partnership between Alden Law and Wolf Corp. The setting was more intimate than the gala, but the air was still thick with artificial smiles and performative handshakes. Maxwell arrived in a navy blue suit, with Talia by his side. She wore a simple black dress, less flashy than before, but still radiantly elegant. Maxwell held her hand, but the grip was firm, possessive, more a claim than an affectionate gesture. Talia offered a faint smile, her eyes drifting across the room without resting on anyone. She was like a shadow present, yet invisible. Dinner began, and as usual, Maxwell dominated the conversation. He boasted about Alden Law, high-profile litigation wins, and his deep ties with political players. The other guests nodded politely. Damien, seated at the head of the table, merely sipped his wine, his expression unreadable. He wasn't listening to Maxwell, he was watching Talia. She sat beside her husband, hands resting in her lap, eyes lowered, as if trying to blend into the chair. Then one of the partners, an older man with a kind smile, turned to her and asked, "What do you think of the project, Mrs. Alden?" The whole table looked her way. Talia froze, her fingers tightening slightly around the napkin under the table. Maxwell laughed, smooth but sharp. "She doesn't need to worry about things like that. Talia just needs to look pretty, right?" The table chuckled, but Talia's smile faltered, her lips pressing into a thin line. Damien noticed the way her hand clenched the napkin until her knuckles turned white. A small detail, but to him, it was a silent scream. He set his wine glass down and locked eyes with her. "What's your opinion on our green tech initiative?" he asked, his voice low, as if the entire room vanished and only the two of them remained. Maxwell opened his mouth to interrupt, but before he could speak, Talia lifted her gaze and looked at Damien. For a brief moment, her composure returned. "I think it needs to focus more on community impact than just profit," she said, her voice soft but steady, every word chosen with care. "Green technology isn't just a product, it's a way we give back to the world." The table fell silent, stunned. Maxwell's brow twitched in displeasure, but he couldn't contradict her. The older partner nodded in approval, clearly impressed. Damien, for the first time that evening, smiled just slightly, but it was enough to light up his deep blue eyes. "A thoughtful answer," he said, his eyes still on her. Talia lowered her gaze, her cheeks tinged with pink, but her fingers slowly released the napkin, as if a weight had been lifted from her shoulders. As the dinner came to an end and the guests began to leave, the room grew quieter. Maxwell stood and tugged Talia up with him. "Let's go," he said flatly. He grabbed her wrist tightly enough that she winced, but she didn't protest. They stepped out of the restaurant, where a sleek black car awaited. Damien, standing at the door to see guests off, watched from a distance. As Talia passed by him, her eyes unintentionally met his. In that instant, Damien didn't smile, but his gaze said, "I see you." Not as Maxwell's wife, not as Mrs. Alden, but as Talia, a soul imprisoned. Talia stepped into the car quietly, but for a second her eyes seemed to reply, "Thank you." As the car rolled away, Maxwell turned to her, voice cold as ice. "Don't think you're smarter than me." He squeezed her wrist again, as if to drive the point home. Talia said nothing. She stared out the window, city lights gliding across her face. But deep inside, something unfamiliar stirred a feeling of being seen, if only for a moment. Back in his private car, Damien sat in the back seat, his eyes lost in the view outside. He absent-mindedly twisted an old silver ring on his finger, a keepsake from his late mother, the only person who had ever loved him unconditionally. He murmured, voice low as if speaking only to himself, "What am I doing?" There was no answer. But the image of Talia, her eyes, her voice, the quiet strength beneath her fragile exterior, stayed with him like a question he couldn't ignore. Maxwell's estate on the outskirts of New York was as cold and lavish as the man himself. In the vast living room, the crystal chandelier's light spilled onto the marble floor, casting harsh patches of brightness and shadow. Talia sat on a velvet armchair, facing the partnership contract between Alden Law and Wolf Corp. Maxwell had tossed it onto the table that morning with a curt command, "Just sign it. No need to understand it." But now alone, Talia opened the document, her fingers trailing over each line, eyes sharp with focus. Numbers, clauses, and strategy unraveled clearly in her mind, the mark of someone once trained at a prestigious business school. Her lips tightened as her finger paused on a complex clause about profit allocation. "He thinks I don't understand," she whispered, her voice soft, but filled with quiet resolve. In that moment, she was no longer Mrs. Alden. She was Talia Grayson, the woman who once dreamed of building something great before being imprisoned in this marriage. Days later at Wolf Corp headquarters, the top-floor conference room resembled a glass fortress above the city. Transparent walls opened to a sweeping view of Manhattan, skyscrapers glittering beneath the morning sun. The air inside was tense, as if everyone felt the weight of this meeting. Damien sat at the head of the table, tall and composed, his charcoal gray suit impeccably tailored, exuding a power that didn't need to be announced. His team lawyers, financial experts, and engineers lined either side of the table, ready to discuss a contract worth billions. Across from him sat Maxwell in a navy suit, his sharp gaze failing to conceal his ambition. Talia sat beside him, dressed in a modest navy blue dress, her hair tied back, hands resting in her lap, eyes lowered. She looked like the perfect, obedient wife, but her fingers lightly tapped her thigh, a subtle signal of both unease and determination. The meeting began. Damien outlined the collaboration plan, his voice deep and clear, devoid of emotion. He spoke of green technology and its potential to revolutionize the energy sector, but his eyes occasionally flicked to Maxwell with an unreadable chill. When it came time to discuss Alden Law's role, Maxwell leaned back with a confident smile. "I'll personally oversee the project," he said smoothly. "Alden Law has the resources to ensure everything runs flawlessly." The partners nodded in agreement until Damien suddenly set his pen down with a small click that sliced through the room's quiet. He raised an eyebrow, his lips curving into a faint, cold smile. "I want Mrs. Alden as the representative," he said calmly, leaving no room for negotiation. The entire room froze. Maxwell stiffened, his smile frozen on his face. "Talia," he muttered as if he hadn't heard correctly. "She has no experience." Damien tilted his head slightly, his gaze as sharp as a blade. "Then there's no deal," he replied, voice soft but cutting like a declaration of war. The Wolf Corp lawyers exchanged glances but dared not speak. Talia lifted her head, brown eyes wide with surprise and confusion. She looked to Damien, searching for a signal, but he didn't look back. His lips curled slightly, as if daring not only Maxwell, but her too. Maxwell, though clearly furious, couldn't reject the proposal. The deal was too valuable. He turned to Talia, his expression icy. "Can you handle this?" he asked, but it wasn't a question. It was a threat. Talia nodded, her voice soft but steady. "I'll do it well." Maxwell scoffed, thinking she was just a puppet he could still control. But Damien, from the end of the table, had a look that said otherwise. The meeting ended. As the partners filed out, the room grew quiet again. Talia stayed behind to sign some documents, her hands trembling slightly as she held the pen. She felt the weight of responsibility, but also, strangely, a spark of something else. The feeling of being trusted, even if only by someone who was nearly a stranger. Damien walked over, picked up a cup of coffee from the table and handed it to her. "Drink," he said, his tone calm. Talia accepted it, her fingers accidentally brushing his, and she quickly pulled back, her cheeks flushing. "Where did you study business?" Damien asked, his eyes locked on hers as if trying to see straight into her soul. Talia hesitated, gripping the cup tightly. "How did you know?" she asked in a near whisper. Damien offered a rare, quiet smile that lit up his deep blue eyes. "Your eyes don't lie," he said, his voice low, as if sharing a secret only the two of them would understand. She looked down, unsure of how to respond. Damien didn't pressure her. He just stood there, silently watching. In that moment, Talia felt truly seen, not as Mrs. Alden, not as Maxwell's wife, but as Talia, a woman with dreams and potential buried beneath the surface. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice so faint it barely existed. Damien nodded, then turned away, leaving her with the still warm cup in her hands. Back at home, the atmosphere in the mansion was as heavy as an approaching storm. Maxwell waited in the living room, still dressed in his suit, eyes cold as ice. He hurled the contract onto the table, the paper landing with a sharp thud against the wood. "Don't think you can do anything other than obey me," he snapped, every word like a blade. Talia stood before him, arms at her sides, but for the first time, she didn't bow her head. She looked him straight in the eyes, no longer trembling. "I'll do it well," she said softly, but with unwavering resolve, a silent declaration. Maxwell scoffed again, but there was something uneasy in his eyes, as if he sensed that she was no longer the obedient wife he once controlled. That night, Talia sat alone in the bedroom, the soft glow from the bedside lamp casting warm light across her face. She opened her laptop and searched for information on Wolf Corporation. The homepage loaded, and Damien's photo appeared him in a black suit, his gaze sharp but deep. She paused, her fingertip brushing the screen gently across his face. "What do you see in me?" she whispered, her voice trembling. She had no answer. But deep inside her, a small fire had begun to burn, the fire of confidence, of hope, and of Italia slowly returning to life. A week after the pivotal meeting, the Wolf Corp headquarters still stood like a gleaming glass fortress in the heart of Manhattan. But today, the atmosphere in the top-floor conference room carried a different weight. Morning sunlight streamed through the transparent walls, casting patterns on the glossy walnut table where neatly arranged documents waited. Talia Grayson stepped inside, her high heels striking the marble floor with confident rhythm. She wore a tailored black suit that hugged her slender frame, sharp yet graceful. Her hair was tied in a sleek ponytail, and her eyes were focused like a warrior entering the battlefield. In her hands was a meticulously prepared binder, pages marked with highlighter and filled with precise notes. Her heart pounded, not from fear, but from the thrill of becoming herself again. For the first time in 3 years of marriage, she wasn't Mrs. Alden. She wasn't the obedient wife of Maxwell. She was Talia, the woman who once dreamed of conquering the world with her intellect. She took a deep breath, tightened her grip on the binder, and walked into the room. The atmosphere inside felt like a chessboard, every move capable of shifting the balance. Damien sat at the head of the table, sharp in his charcoal suit, his deep blue eyes scanning the room with his usual calm detachment. Around him sat his team: lawyers, engineers, financial analysts, alongside the delegation from Alden Law, including Maxwell, seated directly across from Damien with his signature, cold, confident smile. Talia sat beside him, yet the emotional distance between them felt like an unbridgeable chasm. Maxwell didn't look at her. His eyes were locked onto Damien's, as though the two men were locked in an unspoken war. The meeting began, and from the outset, it was intense. Damien presented the revised contract terms, his voice deep and sharp, leaving no room for ambiguity. But it wasn't Damien who lit the spark of tension, it was Ryan, his assistant. Tall and lean, Ryan carried an arrogant air and a perpetual smirk. He stood, gesturing toward a chart on the screen, then turned to Talia with a mocking gleam in his eyes. "Mrs. Alden," he said smoothly, but with thinly veiled contempt, "could you explain why this profit distribution model is viable? Or is it just another idealistic idea from Alden Law?" The room fell silent. Every eye turned to Talia. Maxwell frowned but said nothing, as if silently hoping she'd stumble, just to prove his point. Talia sat still, her hands resting on the table, fingers tapping softly, a habit when she was under pressure. Most expected her to fold, to lower her head and let Ryan continue. But then she looked up, her brown eyes locked onto Ryan's without a flicker of fear. "This model isn't idealistic," she said clearly, every word deliberate. "It's based on long-term analysis of the renewable energy market. If we prioritize short-term profit, we lose the trust of local communities, and that's the real risk." She continued speaking, voice gaining confidence with each sentence. She cited data, analyzed risks, and offered targeted adjustments with such clarity and precision that the entire room sat stunned. Ryan, who had been poised to interrupt, could only stand there, mouth slightly open, unable to find a flaw. Maxwell's fists clenched beneath the table, his eyes darkening, but he had no recourse. Damien, watching from the head of the table, took a slow sip of his coffee. The corner of his mouth lifted just enough to conceal a satisfied smile. "Clear and compelling," he said, voice steady, his gaze resting on Talia with wordless approval. She lowered her eyes, a soft blush coloring her cheeks, but inside a small flame had begun to burn, the flame of confidence, of being seen for who she truly was. The meeting ended. The partners began to leave, leaving only a few behind to finalize documents. Damien stayed and casually called her over. "Did you review the clause about community grants?" he asked, handing her a file. Talia nodded, flipping through the pages and answering with the same precision she had shown earlier. Then Damien's voice softened. "What do you enjoy outside of work?" he asked, his eyes gentle, as if inviting her out of her shell. Talia hesitated, fingers nervously twisting together. "I used to like drawing," she said softly, like revealing a secret. Damien nodded. his gaze unwavering. "Why don't you draw anymore?" he asked, his voice low, as if he genuinely wanted to know. Talia gave a faint, melancholic smile, her eyes drifting. "No time," she replied, her voice filled with quiet regret. In a brief moment, their hands brushed as he handed her another document. Time seemed to pause. His fingers were warm, steady, so unlike Maxwell's cold, controlling grip. Talia quickly pulled her hand back, her heart pounding, but her eyes didn't leave his. Damien looked at her, his eyes deep, as if trying to say something he couldn't quite put into words. "You don't have to be someone else when you're here," he said softly, every word like a quiet promise. Talia inhaled slowly, saying nothing, but her eyes for a moment seemed to whisper, "I want to believe you." She left the Wolf Corp building and stepped into the bustling New York streets. Cold wind brushed past her, but she didn't feel alone. Inside, something new had begun to grow, a sense of being herself, even if only for a few hours. When she returned to the mansion, Maxwell was not home, and she felt a wave of relief. She entered the bedroom, sat before the mirror, and untied her hair, letting the brown waves fall naturally. She looked at her reflection, not Mrs. Alden, not the perfect wife, but Talia, a woman rediscovering herself. And for the first time in years, she smiled, not for anyone else, not to please anyone, but because she was beginning to feel the strength within her. Late afternoon at Wolf Corp headquarters, crimson sunlight poured through the glass walls, washing the marble floor of the 68th floor in hues of gold. The office, usually filled with the hum of conversations and footsteps, had quieted to near silence. Only the faint clacking of keyboard strokes and the soft glow of desk lamps remained. Talia Grayson sat at a small conference table, eyes fixed on her laptop, finalizing the report for the Alden Law Partnership. Across from her sat Damien Wolf, sleeves rolled up, his sharp gaze scanning the figures in the documents. The atmosphere between them was subdued, yet taut, like a wire pulled just shy of breaking. They had stayed late to complete the report, and now, as the clock struck 6 p.m., they were the only two remaining in the office. Talia typed quickly and precisely, her movements reflecting an intelligence long hidden. Damien, though focused on the paperwork, occasionally glanced at her, not to check the progress, but to note the subtleties, how she pressed her lips when concentrating, how her fingers tapped the table when deep in thought, how a strand of brown hair repeatedly fell across her forehead, only to be brushed aside unconsciously. He reminded himself to maintain distance, but each moment spent in proximity to her made it increasingly difficult. "It's done," Talia said quietly but clearly, sliding the laptop toward Damien. He nodded, skimming the report, his attention pausing on a particularly intricate chart she had drafted. "Well done," he murmured, voice low, with a glint of approval in his eyes. Talia gave a faint smile, though it faded almost instantly, as if fearful of revealing too much. "We should go," she added, rising and gathering her bag. Damien nodded, switched off the lamp, and together they stepped out, leaving the office in darkness behind them. They entered the elevator. The metallic doors closed with a muted ding. In the enclosed space, Damien's woody cologne mingled with the subtle jasmine scent of Talia's perfume, forming a charged atmospheric silence. The elevator began its descent, but abruptly jolted between the 10th and 11th floors, emitting a metallic screech before coming to a stop. The fluorescent light cut out, replaced by the dim red of the emergency panel. Talia inhaled deeply, striving for composure, but her fingers clutched the strap of her handbag, knuckles pale. Damien noticed, his eyes adjusting to the dimness. "Are you all right?" he asked, voice low, his concern unmasked. Talia nodded, though her eyes said otherwise, betraying a subtle undercurrent of panic. "I'm fine," she replied, voice trembling slightly as she attempted to self-soothe. She leaned against the elevator wall, breathing slowly. The physical space between them, mere feet, felt increasingly compressed. Damien remained standing opposite her, hands in his pockets, eyes on her, silent. For the 15 minutes they remained stuck. There were no touches, no words, but the silence between them was not empty. It was charged, a quiet storm of emotion. Talia's breath came quicker. Her chest rose and fell in the muted red glow. Damien, while composed, could feel his pulse rising. Their eyes met in the darkness, neither willing to look away. It was a game of vulnerability, a test. Who would flinch first? Damien broke the silence. His voice was low, deliberate, each word chosen with care. Do you love your husband? The question struck like a stone into still water, sending waves rippling through the fragile quiet. Talia's head lifted, brown eyes wide, glinting in the emergency light. She took a breath, fingers tightening on the handbag strap as if bracing herself against collapse. I used to think I could learn to, she said, voice quivering, each word heavy with quiet pain. She didn't look at Damien, her gaze drifted into space, as if confessing to herself. But some things can't be learned. Damien remained silent, his gaze locked on her. He wanted to speak, to reach out, but he stood still, fists clenched in his pockets. Her response was more than an answer. It was a glimpse inside her, a spirit long imprisoned, yet still yearning for freedom. He felt it, and for the first time in years, the walls around his own heart shifted. Suddenly, the elevator jolted. The white lights flickered back on. With a mechanical ding, the doors slid open. Talia exhaled sharply as if waking from a nightmare. She stepped out without looking back, her steps quick but unsteady, fleeing not the man, but the moment. Damien remained inside, fists clenched, chest tight. He knew he had crossed a boundary, not with action, but with that question, that gaze. He stepped out slowly, watching her silhouette disappear down the hallway. For the first time in a long while, he felt himself losing control. Meanwhile, at Alden Law, Maxwell sat in his executive office, the glow from the computer screen casting harsh shadows on his face. Before him played a silent video clip security footage from the elevator sent by an assistant with the note, "You need to see this." On screen, Talia and Damien alone in the elevator. No audio, but Damien's gaze fixed on her, expressive, unguarded, was enough. Maxwell slammed his hand onto the desk, the echo breaking the silence. "She's mine," he growled, eyes dark, rage simmering beneath his words. He rose from his chair, fingers tightening around his phone, as if poised to act. Back at the mansion, Talia entered the bedroom and closed the door behind her. She sat on the bed, hands trembling in her lap. Damien's image, his question, his eyes still lingered in her mind. She didn't know why, but something inside her had shifted in that elevator. It wasn't love, not yet, but it was the realization that she could be seen, that she could be valued for who she truly was. She took a deep breath and looked up at her reflection in the wall mirror. For the first time, she didn't feel afraid when thinking about the future. Night had fallen over New York, and the city lights shimmered through the glass walls of Damien's private office at the top floor of Wolf Corp. The room was minimalist yet exuded quiet power. A polished ebony desk, a black leather chair, and shelves stacked with books on technology and philosophy. Damien sat alone, the cool blue glow of his laptop screen illuminating his face, casting shadows beneath his deep blue eyes now darkened by what he was reading. In front of him lay a thin folder, discreetly delivered by his assistant at his request. The pages were old, edges yellowed with time, and within them lived the truth of Talia Grayson's marriage, and every word cut into him like a blade. He turned the pages slowly, his fingers steady, but his gaze razor-sharp, absorbing every detail. The documents revealed a brutal truth. Before passing away from illness, Talia's father had signed over the family business, Grayson Enterprises, to Maxwell Alden under one unforgiving condition, that Talia would agree to marry him. The marriage hadn't been about love. It hadn't even been a choice. It was a cold transaction, a price paid to save the company from collapse. Damien paused, gripping the edge of the desk tightly. His eyes darkened. He slammed his fist down. The thud echoed through the silent room. His anger wasn't only for Talia, a woman trapped in a gilded cage, but also for himself. He saw a reflection of his past in her. He, too, had once been manipulated by someone he had loved and trusted. The wound he thought had healed now bled anew. A few days later, during a meeting at Wolf Corp, Damien deliberately let slip some details about Maxwell's firm, A Calculated Test. They were reviewing parts of the contract when Talia offered her thoughts on grant allocation. Damien leaned forward, voice low and deliberate. "Did you know Alden Law was once under investigation for financial fraud?" The statement hit the room like a stone cast into still water. Talia froze. Her wide brown eyes betrayed surprise, confusion. She looked at Damien, her fingers tightening slightly around her pen, but then she shook her head. "I don't want to know things that don't belong to me," she said quietly, but with calm conviction. Her integrity, her refusal to dig into another's secrets, stunned Damien. He nodded and his gaze softened, glimmering with silent respect. "You're different," he murmured, almost to himself. The turning point came one late night when Damien returned to his office, phone in hand. His expression was glacial, voice sharp as he spoke. "Find everything on Maxwell Alden. I wanted all accounts, transactions, relationships. Don't leave out a single detail." He ended the call and turned to the window. The city lights reflected in his eyes. He didn't just want to protect Talia. He wanted to destroy the cage that held her, even if it meant confronting someone like Maxwell. Elsewhere in the cold bedroom of the Alden estate, Talia sat on her bed beneath the soft glow of a bedside lamp. She had just found an old photo in a drawer, Talia in her college years, wearing a white t-shirt, sitting beneath a tree, a pencil in hand as she sketched a landscape. She was smiling, radiant. Her eyes sparkled with dreams. She touched the photo, fingers tracing her younger face, and tears slipped silently down her cheeks. "Who am I now?" she whispered, voice trembling. The photo felt like a whisper from her past, a reminder of the woman she once was, and a painful question about the woman she had become. Still following the story? If this story found you outside of Soul Stories, we invite you home, to where every touching tale begins with truth, hope, and heart. The small park near Wolf Corp's headquarters was a peaceful oasis in the heart of Manhattan, where crimson maple leaves blazed beneath the soft glow of early autumn sun. Talia sat on a worn wooden bench, a small sketchbook open on her lap. Her hand moved slowly, tracing the delicate curves of a flower, each stroke a quiet attempt to rediscover herself through the pencil's motion. She wore a simple gray sweater, her hair left loose, no makeup, no designer clothes. In this moment, she wasn't Mrs. Alden. She wasn't the perfect wife of Maxwell. She was simply Talia, a woman trying to remember her own dreams. Damien, in a rare moment away from the office, happened to pass by and saw her. He stopped, several feet away, caught off guard by the image before him. This wasn't the woman from tense meetings. This was someone softer, more human, fragile, but alive. He walked over, the sound of his leather shoes lightly tapping against the gravel path. He sat beside her without asking. Talia looked up, surprised, but she didn't object. She closed the sketchbook and rested it on her lap, her fingers twisting gently together, a small habit that surfaced whenever she felt uneasy. Damien tilted his head slightly, eyes flicking toward the book. "What are you drawing?" he asked, his deep voice carrying no pressure. Talia hesitated, fingers brushing the book's edge. "Just random lines," she replied softly. But then she opened it and showed him the unfinished drawing of a flower. Damien looked at it, his gaze intent, as if trying to memorize every detail. "It's beautiful," he said sincerely, like the person who drew it. Talia looked down, a faint blush rising to her cheeks, but she didn't respond. They started talking. Not about work, not about contracts, but about simple things. Talia told him about her college days, how she once dreamed of becoming an artist, how she used to spend hours sketching sunlit fields and quiet roads. But then she paused, her eyes drifting away. "Marriage took it all," she said quietly, her voice heavy with loss. Damien listened without interrupting, his eyes absorbing every word as if trying to hold them gently in his hands. He saw her not as a wife, not as a professional partner, but as a person, full of dreams that had been buried alive. He took a breath and his gaze grew serious. "Talia," he said, calling her by name for the first time, not Mrs. Alden. "If you want, I can help you leave Maxwell." His voice was low, but the words carried the weight of a promise. But Talia shook her head, her eyes steady. "I'm not someone who needs to be saved," she replied softly but firmly. "I just need someone to believe I'm worth living as myself." Her words silenced him. Something shifted in Damien's eyes, not desire, not pity, but a deep, quiet respect. He looked at her as if, for the first time, he truly saw her. Not as someone broken, not as someone waiting to be rescued, but as a woman who had always held the power to save herself, if only someone believed in her. Talia stood, her sketchbook held close to her chest. She turned slightly, her gaze meeting his. "Talia," he called again, his voice low, weighted with emotion. She paused. Her heart thudded, but she only nodded, then turned and walked away, her figure melting into the golden afternoon light. Damien watched her go, heart pounding not because of love, but because, for the first time, he had found someone worth changing for. Rain poured over New York like a gray curtain, cloaking the skyscrapers and turning the streets into shallow rivers. Inside the Wolf Corp headquarters, Talia Grayson stepped into the grand lobby, the shoulders of her beige trench coat soaked through. She sensed the strange gaze of a man standing near the elevators, not a Wolf Corp employee, not a familiar associate, but a stranger with a cold, sharp look. Maxwell had sent someone to follow her. She knew it, but she didn't let it shake her. She took a deep breath, brushed back her wet hair, and stepped into the elevator, her gaze focused and firm like a warrior heading into battle. She was here to work, and nothing was going to stop her. Damien had invited her in over the weekend to finalize the last details of the Wolf Corp and Alden Law partnership. When she entered the conference room on the 68th floor, the sky outside had already turned dark. Rain hammered the tall windows, blurring the view with streaks of misty water. Damien stood near the glass, sleeves of his white shirt rolled up, watching the storm spread over the city. He turned when he heard her footsteps, and for a brief second, something lit in his eyes, but he masked it with a soft smile. "You're early," he said, his voice low, motioning toward the documents on the table. Talia nodded, slipping off her coat to reveal a form-fitting navy dress. She sat down, opened her laptop, and got to work. But the air between them held more than business. A quiet tension hummed like a wire drawn taut, pulling them slowly closer. They worked mostly in silence, exchanging only the occasional remark about numbers or clauses. But Damien's eyes, when he thought she wasn't looking, often wandered to her. The way she pressed her lips when concentrating, the way her fingers tapped softly when she was deep in thought, the way she tucked her hair behind her ear. Talia felt his gaze even without looking, and her heart beat faster. She tried to stay focused, but each time Damien leaned in to point something on the screen, his breath close to her skin made her shiver. When they finished, the rain outside was still coming down in sheets. Damien stood, walked to the coat rack near the door, and took down a sleek black umbrella. "You'll need this," he said, offering it to her. Their hands brushed as she took it, and they both froze eyes, meeting in a pause that lasted a second too long. His gaze held something he didn't say, a promise, a quiet care too deep for words. But all he said was, "Don't let yourself get soaked." Talia nodded, her fingers tightening around the handle. Her heart thudded in her chest. She stepped out of the room, but inside her, something new had begun to bloom. Not love, not yet, but courage. Down in the lobby, she stood before the tall glass doors, watching the rain fall like a curtain between her and the world. She held Damien's umbrella in her hand, but instead of opening it, she walked out into the rain. She let it soak her hair, her clothes, her face. The cold sting of it didn't bother her. It made her feel alive. For the first time, she wasn't afraid. Not of Maxwell, not of what people thought, not of who she had once been. She stood there, eyes closed, letting the rain wash away the years of captivity. When she opened them again, her gaze was steady, like someone who had just remembered who she truly was. At Alden Law, Maxwell sat in his office when a message lit up his phone. Attached was a photo from his hired informant. Talia, standing in the rain, holding Damien's umbrella, closed, her soaked hair clinging to her cheeks, eyes burning with unmistakable resolve. Maxwell's grip tightened. With his other hand, he slammed a glass of whiskey onto the desk, shattering it. Shards flew everywhere. "She dares!" he roared, his eyes bloodshot with fury and panic. He could feel her slipping through his fingers, and the control he once had was unraveling. Back at the mansion, Talia stepped through the front door, coat soaked through, droplets still falling from her hair. Maxwell was waiting in the living room. The chandelier's light caught the sharp edges of his face as he stood. He walked toward her, voice low and menacing. Who do you think you are? Talia looked him in the eye. She didn't lower her head. She didn't flinch. I'm Talia Grayson, she said, calm but powerful. Each word was a declaration. Maxwell froze, caught off guard by the steadiness in her tone. His expression wavered, but he quickly covered it with a sneer. You'll regret this, he snapped, turning away. But Talia stood firm, grounded in something new. Not fear, but strength. The strength of someone who didn't run. She chose to stay, not to surrender, but to fight. The Grand Hall in the heart of Manhattan glowed under brilliant lights, but the atmosphere inside was heavy, like a storm about to break. What was meant to be a press conference announcing the final details of the partnership between Wolf Corp and Alden Law had been overshadowed by rumors flooding the media. An affair between Damian Wolf and Talia Grayson. Reporters packed the room, cameras flashing nonstop, microphones raised high, ready to capture every word. Behind the whispers and curious stares was the hand of Maxwell Alden, who had orchestrated the scandal to trap Talia deeper in his gilded cage. Backstage, Talia stood with her heart pounding, fingers clenched around the speech Maxwell had written for her. The flimsy sheet, just a few lines long, demanded she deny all rumors, declare loyalty to her husband, and protect the image of Alden Law. Maxwell stood just behind her, his breath hot against her neck, his voice a cold blade. You know what to say. One mistake, and you'll regret it for the rest of your life. Talia nodded, but her fingers trembled. One corner of the page tore under the pressure of her grip. She could feel Maxwell's gaze like a predator, waiting for its prey to fall apart. She stepped onto the stage, flashes blinded her. The crowd fell silent, the only sounds the clicks of cameras and the low murmur of tension in the air. Talia took a deep breath. Her voice was even as she began to read. There is no relationship between myself and Mr. Wolf. The rumors are baseless and meant to sabotage the partnership agreement. But when she reached the final sentence, her voice faltered, as though her heart refused to speak the lie. Her hands shook. She looked up, scanning the crowd, and then she saw him. Damian stood near the exit, dressed in black, hands in his pockets, his deep blue eyes calm, no judgment, no pressure, only trust. He was her anchor in the storm, and his gaze said, "You don't have to do this." That moment split the fog in Talia's mind. She stopped reading. The paper fell from her hand and fluttered to the floor like a leaf. Gasps echoed through the room. The reporters stirred, mics raised higher. Backstage, Maxwell clenched his fists, his face stone cold, lips pressed so tightly they turned white. A young female reporter stood up, voice cutting through the silence. "Mrs. Alden, do you love your husband?" The question sliced through every mask. The room froze, all eyes locked on Talia. She gripped the microphone tighter, her knuckles white. Her gaze flicked to Damian once more. He hadn't moved. His eyes burned steady like a fire that warmed her in the cold. Talia stayed silent. Then, without a word, she set the microphone down with a sharp clack. She stepped off the stage, head high, step steady, like a woman who had just shattered her chains. The room erupted, flashes, whispers, chaos. But Talia didn't care. She had chosen herself. In the shadowed corner of the room, Damian watched, heart pounding. He wasn't surprised, but he was proud. Talia hadn't needed him to speak for her. She had stood on her own. Still, he knew the cost of what she'd just done. Behind the scenes, he had already begun dismantling the partnership with Alden Law, not out of anger, but to protect her. He had tasked his legal team with finding every loophole, every exit clause, ensuring Talia would remain untouched when everything collapsed. He didn't want to pull her out of the cage. He wanted to destroy the cage itself. The chapter's climax came when Maxwell, furious and humiliated, yanked Talia into a private room after the press conference. The heavy wooden door slammed shut behind them, the echo like a declaration of war. Inside the small meeting room, with its gray walls and flickering fluorescent lights, Maxwell unleashed his fury. His face was twisted, eyes bloodshot, breath heaving with rage. "You stupid little bitch," he roared, his voice cracking the still air like a whip. "Who do you think you are, humiliating me in front of the world? You're nothing without me. Garbage. You'd be nowhere if it weren't for me." He advanced on her, finger pointing inches from her face, hand trembling in fury. You just stood there like an idiot while the whole country laughed at me? You want to destroy me, is that it? Talia stood her ground, back straight, eyes locked on his. She didn't flinch even as her pulse raced, her breath catching in her throat. Each word from him was a blade, but she didn't bleed. She took a deep breath. Her voice came soft but firm. I don't want to destroy you. I just want to be myself. The words struck like fire in the cold room, but they were also the final spark. Maxwell, completely unhinged, raised his hand and slapped her across the face. Smack! The sound cracked like lightning. Talia staggered, hand rising to her burning cheek. Pain bloomed, but she didn't cry. She didn't fall. She looked up, and the eyes that met his were no longer those of a submissive wife. They were the eyes of a woman who had found her power. You don't control me anymore, she said, voice trembling but unbreakable. Maxwell stood frozen, hands still raised, thrown off by her defiance. He slammed his fist into the wall instead, the thud reverberating through the room. You'll pay for this, he growled. Talia stood firm, her hand still on her cheek, eyes burning bright. She wasn't afraid. She didn't feel like a victim. That slap wasn't the end. It was the beginning of a woman reborn, no longer living in his shadow. She walked out of the room, head held high, and when the door clicked shut behind her, she knew there was no going back. The central hall in Manhattan, dazzling with marble pillars and the blinding flashes of hundreds of cameras, had become the stage for the week's most anticipated press conference. Damian Wolf, CEO of Wolf Corp, stood at the podium tall, composed in a sharply tailored black suit, his deep blue eyes as cold as ice. The press event was meant to address the swirling rumors of an affair between him and Talia Grayson, and to announce the future of the Wolf-Alden partnership. The crowd of reporters sat still. Only the clicks of shutters and the subtle scrape of microphones disturbed the tension. Damian began, his voice low and unwavering. There is no inappropriate relationship between myself and Mrs. Alden. These rumors are fabricated attempts to damage the reputation of Wolf Corp and the people involved. The silence was sharp-edged. Reporters held their microphones like weapons, waiting for a crack. A young journalist, her eyes sharp as a scalpel, stood and asked, Mr. Wolf, how do you feel being accused of falling in love with a married woman? The question hit like a bullet, but Damian didn't flinch. He tilted his head slightly, eyes glinting with something unshakable. I am not ashamed to love a strong woman, he said, voice steady, resonant, even if she's married. Then he added, each word striking like a hammer. But I am ashamed of those who use love to manipulate, to imprison, to strip someone of who they are. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Damian didn't look at the cameras. His eyes gazed beyond them, as if speaking directly to Talia. She wasn't in the room, but he knew she was listening. In a small temporary apartment near downtown, Talia sat in front of the TV, arms wrapped around herself, eyes fixed on the screen. Damian's words weren't a love confession. They were something deeper, a profound recognition of who she truly was. Tears streamed down her face, not from sadness, but from something stronger. For the first time, she felt seen, not as Mrs. Alden, not as Maxwell's ornament, but as Talia Grayson, a woman with strength and dreams. Memories surged like a flood. 3 years ago, her wedding day. Talia, 23, stood in the bridal suite before a mirror. The white dress was flawless, but her eyes were heavy with sorrow. Her father had died only months before, leaving Grayson Enterprises on the brink of collapse. Maxwell, with his charming smile and promises of salvation, offered a solution, marriage in exchange for ownership. Young and desperate, Talia agreed. Not out of love, but out of duty. During the ceremony, Maxwell held her hand, but it was cold, empty. As the priest pronounced them husband and wife, he leaned in and whispered, "Don't disappoint me, Talia. You know your role." The words coiled around her heart like a chain. After the guests left, instead of a honeymoon, Maxwell dropped a contract on the bed. "This is why we're here," he said flatly, demanding she sign away the last of her father's company. She did, hand trembling, tears falling, and said nothing. From that day, he controlled everything. What she wore, what she couldn't work on, even mocking her dreams of art. Once she showed him a finished painting. He scoffed. "You think you're an artist? You're my wife. That's all you need to be." The memory faded, leaving behind a heart heavy but resolute. Damien's words had lit a fire in her. Talia stood. She packed a small suitcase. It was time to return to the Alden estate one last time, to collect her things and face Maxwell. At the Alden estate in the New York suburbs, Maxwell sat watching the press conference live. His eyes were bloodshot. He gripped his glass of wine so hard the stem cracked. Damien's words were a slap in the face, and Talia's silence during her own press conference still burned. The media was turning on him. Public opinion was slipping through his fingers. When Talia stepped through the estate gates, drenched from the rain, trench coat clinging to her frame, Maxwell was already waiting, like a cornered animal ready to attack. Rain poured down, turning the entrance into a storm-drenched stage. Maxwell blocked the gate, his suit rumpled, hair plastered to his forehead. "You think you can just leave?" he shouted, voice louder than the rain. "You ungrateful bitch. You're nothing without me." Talia stopped, eyes unwavering. She didn't step back. She took a breath, and for the first time, she spoke her truth. "You didn't marry me out of love, Maxwell. You married me for my father's company, for power, for image, for a puppet to show off. I tried to love you, but all you ever gave me was control and contempt. This was never a marriage. It was a transaction, and I'm done being your property." The words cut like blades. Maxwell's face twisted in rage. "You dare say that to me?" he screamed, lunging forward, finger pointed in her face. "You're trash. You're nothing." Talia said nothing. Her silence was louder than any shout. It was the final crack. Maxwell lost control. He raised his hand and struck her across the face. Smack. The slap echoed even above the rain. Talia staggered, hand to her cheek. The sting flared hot, but she didn't fall. She looked up, eyes no longer afraid. "You can't imprison me anymore," she said, her voice quiet but unshakable. What Maxwell didn't know was that a journalist had followed, hidden behind the trees. Camera tucked in a coat. The entire scene. The fight, the slap, her confession was captured. The video went live within hours, and the nation gasped. Social media exploded. The press turned against Maxwell, labeling him a manipulator, a violent man. Public sympathy swung to Talia. They called her the woman who stood up. Elsewhere, Damien, fresh out of the press conference, watched the video on his phone. He smiled, not because he had beaten Maxwell, but because Talia had freed herself. She didn't need him to save her, and that made him respect her even more. Talia walked away from the Alden estate. The rain fell on her face. She tilted her head back, letting it wash everything away. She felt light, unburdened. For the first time, the world felt wide open, and she smiled. Not because she had won, but because she had finally found herself again. You're watching Soul Stories, exclusive to our channel. If you're still with us, drop a comment. We read and cherish them all. Subscribe to support more heartfelt, original stories. Thanks for being part of the Soul Stories family. The law office was small and tucked away in a quiet corner of New York, with plain white walls and the faint scent of old paper lingering in the air. Talia sat across from an older female attorney, her gaze calm but unwavering. In front of her lay the divorce papers, just a few thin sheets of paper, but they carried the weight of everything she had endured. "I don't want the assets. I don't want the name," Talia said, voice soft but steady, a declaration of intent. "I only want my freedom." The attorney gave a slow nod, her eyes gleaming with quiet admiration. "Are you sure?" she asked gently. Talia smiled. Her eyes were clear, almost glowing. "I've never been more certain." Maxwell, of course, didn't let go easily. He showed up at the law office a few days later, still in his impeccable suit, but his eyes were darker now, laced with menace. "You think you can just walk away from me without consequences?" he growled, jabbing a finger toward her. "I will destroy you, your name, your future, everything." Talia didn't flinch. Her spine was straight, her expression unshaken. She met his eyes not with fear, but with clarity. You've destroyed enough already, she said, her voice low but sharp. Now it's my turn to rebuild. Maxwell's fists clenched, his body bristling with rage. He looked ready to lunge at her, but something in Talia's gaze, that calm, undeniable conviction, stopped him cold. He turned and slammed the door behind him, but in his heart he knew she was no longer the woman he could control. Talia signed the divorce papers. Her hand didn't shake, her eyes didn't waver. When she stepped out of that office, it felt like something invisible, but heavy, had finally been lifted from her shoulders. She didn't take anything from Maxwell. No property, no reputation, nothing but herself. Back in her temporary apartment, she found a letter waiting on her kitchen counter. Not an email, not through an assistant, but a handwritten envelope delivered directly by someone who cared enough not to send it through channels. She opened it. Her fingers brushed across bold, elegant handwriting. Damien's. Talia, when you are ready to be no one but yourself, come find me. Not where there are titles, but where only the truth lives. No, I love you. No promises. Just a quiet invitation. Honest and free of pressure. Talia smiled. She didn't write back. Not yet. Instead, she folded the letter gently and placed it inside her bag. Not as a destination, but as a reminder. She had time. Time to find her way back to herself. Paris, 6 months later, was a living painting. Cobblestone streets lined with oak trees, the scent of fresh baked bread drifting on the breeze, and golden light pouring over rooftops like honey. Tucked away in a quiet corner of Montmartre was Le Petit Coin, a tiny café with faded yellow walls, time-worn wooden tables, and large windows that welcomed the morning sun. Damien Wolfe sat in the corner seat, where light filtered through the glass and painted soft patches across his face. He wore a pale blue linen shirt, sleeves casually rolled, no longer the sharp-guarded CEO the world once knew. Before him sat a cup of coffee, long gone cold. He didn't mind. This was the place he used to visit as a student, where he'd sit for hours with a book and his not-yet-shaped dreams. Here he wasn't Damien Wolfe of Wolfe Corp. Here he was just Damien, a man searching for what was real within himself. He gazed out the window, watching the quiet hum of people pass by, but his thoughts were elsewhere. For 6 months, he hadn't reached out to Talia. No calls, no emails. Just that one handwritten letter he sent. Before she left New York. He didn't know if she ever read it, but somehow he believed, if it was meant to be, they'd meet again. He turned his mother's old silver ring slowly on his finger. A habit when lost in thought, and a small, wistful smile tugged at his lips. He wasn't waiting, but he was hoping. The door chimed softly. Ting! And she stepped inside. Talia Grayson. She wore a long white coat. Her dark brown hair was gently pinned at the nape of her neck, her face untouched by makeup, radiant in its quiet natural beauty. Like autumn sunlight. She didn't look surprised to see him, as if her heart had already known. He would be here. Not fate, just a quiet alignment. Their eyes met and she smiled, not brightly but warmly, a smile that slowed the whole world down. Damien stood, his eyes lighting up, but he didn't say a word. He simply gestured to the seat across from him. Talia placed her bag down, took the seat, her fingers resting lightly on the table, tapping a slow rhythm. Not out of nervousness, but out of newfound confidence. They looked at each other. No rush, no expectation, only mutual understanding, deep and unspoken. You look different, Damien said, his voice low, his eyes soft, tracing her not to judge, but to remember. Talia tilted her head, smiling faintly. I'm just myself now. She answered, quiet but sure, a whispered declaration of self. They talked. Not about Maxwell, not about the bruised past. They spoke of simple things, as if time had never pulled them apart. Talia spoke of a novel she was reading, a French story about a woman rediscovering her dreams. She laughed as she recalled spilling coffee on its pages. Damien chuckled, genuinely, a sound soft and real, as if something inside him had finally thawed. He told her about this cafe, about how he once sat here with wild ideas about technology and changing the world. I used to think I could fix everything, he said, his eyes distant. Then he looked back at her. Now I just want to live honestly. Talia nodded, her finger tracing the rim of her coffee cup. She told him about a painting she'd just finished. A sunflower field beneath a bright blue sky, something she'd once dreamed of painting in college. I started drawing again, she said, eyes glowing. Not to prove anything, just to feel alive. Damien listened. His gaze never left her, as if memorizing every detail. The curve of her smile, the way sunlight kissed her hair, the tremble in her voice when she spoke of dreams. He didn't interrupt, just nodded. And in that moment, they weren't CEO and former client, not survivors of betrayal. Just Damien and Talia, two souls who had found each other among the wreckage. Damien stood, eyes deep but gentle. He extended a hand palm open, not as a demand, but an invitation. Are you ready? He asked, voice hushed, but filled with unshakable sincerity. Talia looked at him, her warm brown eyes steady. No more fear, she smiled. Not as a woman falling in love, but as one who had finally found freedom and was ready to love. I'm ready, she said, soft but strong, a promise to herself. She placed her hand in his, her touch warm, certain, and in that contact, the world seemed to hold its breath. Just the quiet rhythm of two hearts finally in sync. They stepped out of the cafe, hand in hand, no hurry, no words needed. The sun filtered through the cafe windows, painting soft golden patterns on the walls. Strangers passed by, not noticing the two people who had found each other again. Not for rescue, but to walk side by side, went out of the shadows, and into whatever light waited next.